A cleaning lady can't pay her rent, a millionaire sees it and gives her the keys to his house. But when he gets home, what happens next is shocking. The rain fell in sheets, droplets shattering against the windshield of Brian Mitchell's Audi as he drove through the city's dimly lit streets. Each swipe of the wipers revealed a bleak urban landscape, glistening asphalt, empty sidewalks, and the occasional hunched figure hurrying to escape the downpour. It was nearly midnight, and Brian was heading home after another 18-hour workday, his mind still processing spreadsheets and investment portfolios. At 42, Brian had mastered the art of precision. His life operated like the expensive Swiss watch on his wrist, methodical, accurate, and coldly efficient. He had built his wealth through calculating risks and avoiding emotional decisions. His investment firm managed billions, and his personal fortune had grown to numbers that seemed almost fictional. Yet, despite his success, or perhaps because of it, Brian lived alone in a sprawling mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. The traffic light ahead turned red, forcing him to stop. Brian drummed his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, his eyes absently scanning the rain-soaked street. That's when he saw them, a woman and a small child, huddled beneath the meager shelter of a storefront awning. The woman clutched several torn plastic bags to her chest, while the little girl, no more than 6 or 7, pressed against her mother's side. Brian wouldn't have given them a second glance on any other night. The city was full of struggling people, and he had trained himself to look past them, to focus on his own carefully constructed world. But something made him look again. The landlord stood across from them, a burly man gesturing wildly, his voice carrying across the empty street, even through the closed windows of Brian's car. "That's not my problem. No rent, no apartment. Those are the rules." The woman didn't shout back. She simply gathered her belongings tighter and took her daughter's hand, stepping out into the rain without a destination. Brian's finger hovered over the button to roll the window up, to block out this scene that didn't concern him. But he hesitated. The little girl looked back at the building that had been her home, her dark eyes wide with confusion and fear. The mother's shoulders were hunched not in defeat, but in a protective stance around her child, as if her body could shield the girl from both the rain and their uncertain future. Before Brian could process what he was doing, he had pulled his car to the curb beside them. The woman startled when he lowered his window, immediately pulling her daughter closer. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, the wariness of someone who had learned that strangers rarely offered help without expecting something in return. "So you need a place to stay?" The words left Brian's mouth before he could reconsider. The woman stared at him, rainwater streaming down her face. For a moment he thought she hadn't heard him. "I have a house," he continued, feeling strangely awkward. "It's empty. You can stay there until you figure things out." "I'm not looking for charity," she replied, her voice firm despite her desperate situation. Brian recognized the pride in her tone. It was familiar, the same stubborn independence that had driven him to succeed when everyone expected him to fail. "It's not charity," he said. "It's just a house." The little girl tugged at her mother's coat, whispering something that Brian couldn't hear. The woman's resolve seemed to waver as she looked down at her daughter. After a long moment, she nodded. "Just for tonight." Brian reached into his pocket and extracted a set of keys. "The address is on the keychain. It's about 15 minutes. North of here." He hesitated, then added, "I won't be there." The woman accepted the keys with trembling fingers. "Why are you doing this?" Brian looked away, uncomfortable with her direct gaze. "I don't know," he answered honestly. And he didn't. Nothing in his carefully ordered existence had prepared him for this impulsive act. As they drove away in the taxi he'd called for them, Brian sat in his car, staring at the falling rain and wondering what had just happened. For the first time in years he had deviated from his script, and strangely it didn't feel like a mistake. That night Brian checked into a hotel. His spacious penthouse suite felt hollow and impersonal, not unlike his actual home, he realized. As he lay in bed, he thought about the woman and child sleeping in his house. He wondered if they felt as out of place there as he often did. Brian had worked his entire life to build walls between himself and the messy emotions that complicated decision-making. Yet in one rain-soaked moment, he had torn down those walls for a stranger. The question was why. He closed his eyes, but sleep eluded him. Somewhere across the city his house was no longer empty, and somehow that thought brought him more comfort than he was ready to admit. Carol Martinez stood in the foyer of the stranger's house, her wet shoes leaving puddles on the marble floor. The enormity of the place made her feel even smaller than she already felt. Beside her, Denise's eyes widened as she took in the sweeping staircase, the crystal chandelier, the paintings that hung on walls tall enough to make her dizzy. "Mama, is this a castle?" Denise whispered, her small hand clutching Carol's with the fierce grip that had become habitual in recent months. Carol managed a smile. "No, Mija, it's just a very big house." Very big was an understatement. The place was enormous, with more rooms than Carol could count at a glance. The furniture looked expensive but unlived in, as if arranged for a magazine. Photo shoot rather than actual use. There were no family photos, no personal touches, nothing to suggest that anyone actually called this place home. "Come on," Carol said, guiding Denise toward what she hoped was the kitchen. "Let's see if we can find something to eat." The kitchen was state-of-the-art, all gleaming stainless steel and black granite. Carol hesitated before opening the refrigerator, feeling like an intruder, despite having been given permission to be there. Inside, she found little more than condiments, a carton of eggs, and a half-empty bottle of champagne. The pantry was similarly bare, expensive imported pasta, gourmet, coffee beans and a few cans of soup. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had in days. Carol quickly made Denise a simple meal of scrambled eggs and toast, watching as her daughter ate, with the careful deliberation of a child who had learned not to waste food. "Slow down, Mija. There's no rush," Carol said softly, though she understood. The urgency. For too long they had lived meal to meal, never certain when the next one might come. After dinner, Carol found a bathroom off the main hallway and ran a warm bath for Denise. The tub was deep enough that her daughter could have swum laps in it, and the array of expensive soaps and shampoos made Denise giggle with delight. "Look, Mama, bubbles!" Carol's throat tightened as she watched her daughter play in the water, temporarily forgetting the trauma of their eviction. Children were resilient, she knew, but Denise had weathered too many storms in her short life. The weight of maternal guilt pressed down on Carol's shoulders, heavier than the bags she'd carried from their former apartment. Once Denise was clean, and dressed in the only spare clothes they had managed to bring, Carol tucked her into a guest bedroom, with sheets softer than anything they'd ever owned. "Just for tonight," Carol reminded her, as much for herself as for Denise. "Tomorrow we'll figure something out." "Can we stay here forever?" Denise asked, her voice small and hopeful. Carol smoothed her daughter's damp hair. "No, Mija. This isn't our home, but I promise we'll find one." How, she wasn't sure. But she had made promises to Denise that seemed impossible before, and somehow she had kept them. After Denise fell asleep, Carol wandered through the house, trying to understand the man who owned it. Each room was perfectly decorated but felt untouched. It was as if the house had been designed to impress rather than comfort. The living room featured an enormous television and sound system that looked unused. The dining room table was long enough to seat 20, though Carol suspected it rarely hosted even one. In what appeared to be an office, Carol found framed certificates and awards bearing the name Brian Mitchell, Investment Broker of the Year, Excellence in Financial Management. A few newspaper clippings mentioned Mitchell Investment Strategies. And its remarkable success. There were photos of Brian shaking hands with important-looking people, accepting awards, cutting ribbons at charity events, but none of family or friends. Carol recognized the loneliness in these rooms. It was different. From her own struggles, wrapped as they were in financial hardship, but loneliness nonetheless. She made her way back to the bedroom where Denise slept peacefully and lay down beside her daughter. Tomorrow they would have to leave this temporary sanctuary and face reality again. Carol would need to find a new job, one that paid better than her previous position as a house cleaner for an agency that took most of her earnings. She would need to find affordable housing, though such a thing barely existed in this city anymore. But tonight, they were safe. Tonight, they were warm and dry, and tomorrow would have to take care of itself. Carol's last thought before drifting off to sleep was of Brian Mitchell, the stranger who had handed her the keys to his castle without explanation. She wondered what kind of man lived in such a grand house, yet seemed to take no joy in it. And she wondered why, of all the people he could have helped, he had chosen them. On the drive into work the next morning, Brian couldn't stop thinking about Carol and her daughter. He had given them the address of his secondary property, not his main residence, but still an impressive home in an exclusive neighborhood. It had been an impulsive decision that went against every principle he normally lived by. Risk assessment, careful planning, emotional detachment, all abandoned in a moment of what? Compassion, guilt, or perhaps simply the unexpected recognition of something familiar in a stranger's eyes. Brian had grown up poor, though few people in his current social circle knew this. He had worked tirelessly to erase the traces of his humble beginnings, cultivating the polish and confidence that allowed him to move seamlessly among the wealthy and powerful. His childhood memories of evictions and hungry nights had been carefully packed away, stored in the same mental attic where he kept all inconvenient emotions. Yet seeing Carol and her daughter had brought those memories rushing back with unexpected force. The little girl's frightened expression had mirrored his own childhood fear, while the mother's determined stance had reminded him of his own mother's fierce protection. As Brian navigated the morning traffic, his phone rang through the car's speakers. "Mr. Mitchell, this is a courtesy reminder about your meeting with the Blackwood investment team at 9, his assistant's voice announced. "Thank you, Margot, I'll be there. And sir, Mr. Reynolds called again about the lakefront property. He's increased his offer." Brian frowned. The lakefront property, the house where he had sent Carol and her daughter. He had purchased it 3 years ago with vague ideas about weekend retreats that never materialized. Like most of his possessions, it existed primarily as an investment, something to be leveraged and eventually sold for profit. "Tell him I'm still considering," Brian replied after a moment's hesitation. "Yes, sir. Also, the Charity Gala Committee. I need confirmation about your table sponsorship. They're asking for $20,000 this year." "Fine," Brian said absently. He donated to various causes regularly, though he rarely attended the events. It was good for his image and excellent for tax purposes. The actual impact of these donations was something he preferred not to think about too deeply. As he pulled into the underground parking garage of his office building, Brian was struck by a troubling realization. He had spent more time thinking about Carol and her daughter in the past 12 hours than he had thought about any other person in years. It was an unwelcome disruption to his carefully ordered routine. The day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and investment decisions. Brian moved through it all with his usual efficiency, but his thoughts kept straying to the occupants of his second home. Were they comfortable? Had they found everything they needed? Would they still be there when he returned? That last question bothered him more than it should have. It would be better if they were gone, he told himself. Cleaner. No complications, no explanations needed. He could return to his ordered existence, and they could... What? Go where? The reality of their situation intruded on his attempts at rationalization. When the workday finally ended, Brian sat in his car for several minutes, debating his next move. Logic dictated that he should go to his primary residence and give Carol and her daughter space. It was the reasonable course of action. Yet he found himself driving toward the lakefront property instead, pulled by a curiosity he couldn't quite suppress. As he parked in the circular driveway, Brian noticed something unusual, lights glowing warmly from within the house. In the E5D, 3 years he had owned the property. It had never looked lived in, even when he occasionally stayed there. Now, with just a few lamps illuminated, it suddenly resembled the homes he had always envied from afar as a child, places where families gathered, where people belonged. Brian hesitated at his own front door, feeling strangely like an intruder. Should he knock, use his key, announce himself somehow? The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he stood, uncertain about entering his own property because he had impulsively invited strangers to stay there. Before he could decide, the door opened, and Carol stood before him, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. I saw headlights, she explained, stepping back slightly. I didn't expect you to come. Brian cleared his throat. I wanted to make sure everything was adequate. Carol nodded, gesturing for him to enter. It's more than adequate. It's beautiful. Denise thinks we're in a fairy tale. As if summoned by her name, the little girl appeared in the hallway clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. She regarded Brian with solemn eyes before offering a shy smile. Thank you for letting us stay in your castle, she said gravely. Something tightened in Brian's chest, an unfamiliar ache that was not entirely unpleasant. You're welcome, he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Carol placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. We'll be out of your way by tomorrow. I just need to make a few calls. Find a place we can afford. Brian looked around. The house, at the rooms designed to impress but never comfort, at the expensive furnishings that had never brought him any joy, at the little girl who had briefly transformed the space with her innocent wonder. There's no rush, he heard himself say. You can stay until you find something suitable. Carol's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? It was the same question she had asked the night before, and Brian still didn't have a good answer. The house is empty most of the time anyway, he said, with a shrug that aimed for casualness but missed. Carol studied him for a long moment before nodding. Thank you, she said simply. We made dinner. It's nothing fancy, just pasta with what we found in the pantry. There's enough if you'd like some. The invitation caught Brian off guard. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him outside of a restaurant. His initial instinct was to decline, to retreat to the familiar safety of his ordered existence. But the tempting aroma wafting from the kitchen and the hopeful look on Denise's face made him reconsider. That would be nice, he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. As he followed them to the kitchen, Brian became acutely aware that he had just taken another step away from his carefully structured life and into uncharted territory. And for the second time in 24 hours, it didn't feel like a mistake. The dinner was simple. Spaghetti with a basic sauce made from canned tomatoes, garlic, and dried herbs. Brian couldn't remember the last time he had eaten something that wasn't prepared by a professional chef or delivered from an upscale restaurant. Yet as he took his first bite, he was surprised by how satisfying it tasted. Denise dominated the conversation, her initial shyness dissolving as she told Brian about the huge, gigantic bathtub and the magical closet with a light inside. Carol occasionally tried to rein in her daughter's enthusiasm, but Brian found himself enjoying the child's unfiltered observations about his home. And your TV is bigger than our whole old bathroom, Denise exclaimed, gesturing wildly with her fork. Is that so you can watch 100 shows at once? Denise, Carol admonished gently. Don't be rude. It's fine, Brian assured her, his lips curving in what felt like his first genuine smile in months. And no, I don't watch 100 shows. I don't actually watch much TV at all. Denise's eyes widened in disbelief. But you have the biggest TV ever. What's it for then? What? Indeed, Brian thought. Like most of his possessions, the television had been purchased because it was the best available, not because it brought him any particular joy. It was a status symbol, a box to check off on the list of things successful people were supposed to own. I guess I never really thought about it, he admitted. Carol watched this exchange with thoughtful eyes. During a lull in Denise's chatter, she asked, What do you do, Mr. Mitchell? For work, I mean. Brian, he corrected automatically. I run an investment firm. We manage money for people and companies. That sounds important, Carol said, a hint of irony in her voice. Brian felt a flash of defensiveness. It is important. Financial stability is crucial for... He stopped, suddenly hearing how pompous he sounded. It pays well, he finished lamely. Carol nodded, her expression unreadable. I clean houses, she said. Or I did, until the agency cut my hours. Then I couldn't make rent anymore. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Brian shifted, uncomfortably, aware of the vast gulf between their realities. He handled millions of dollars every day, making decisions that affected people's financial futures, while Carol scrubbed other people's toilets, to keep a roof over her daughter's head. What about Denise's father? The question slipped out before Brian could consider its appropriateness. Carol's face tightened. He's not in the picture. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... It's fine, Carol interrupted. He left when I told him I was pregnant, said he wasn't ready to be a father. She glanced at Denise, who was focused on twirling spaghetti around her fork, apparently uninterested in the adult conversation. It's just been the two of us. Brian nodded, unsure how to respond. His own father had abandoned the family when Brian was 8, leaving his mother to raise 3 children on a waitress's salary. The parallel wasn't lost on him, but he had spent decades building walls around such memories. What will you do now? He asked instead. Carol straightened her shoulders slightly. Find another job, a better one, hopefully. Get back on my feet. Her voice was determined, but Brian detected the undertone of exhaustion. I've been taking online classes in medical coding. If I can finish the certification, I could get an office job with benefits. How much more do you need to complete? 3 more courses. But they're on hold now. The payment plan doesn't work when you don't have income. Brian absorbed this information, mentally calculating the cost of such courses against his daily coffee budget. The disparity was staggering. After dinner, Carol insisted on cleaning up, waving away Brian's half-hearted offers to help. Denise tugged on his sleeve, asking if he would read her a bedtime story. Before he could formulate an excuse, Carol intervened. Mr. Mitchell, Brian, is probably very busy, Mija. I'll read to you in a few minutes. Actually, Brian heard himself say, I have time for one story. The words surprised him as much as they did Carol, whose eyebrows rose slightly before she nodded. One story, she agreed, then straight to sleep. Denise led Brian to the guest bedroom where Carol had made up a bed for her. From her backpack, she produced a worn copy of Goodnight Moon, its corners soft from countless readings. This is my favorite, she announced, climbing onto the bed and patting the space beside her expectantly. Brian perched awkwardly on the edge of the mattress, accepting the book with hands that suddenly felt too large and clumsy. He couldn't remember the last time he had read a children's book, probably not since his own childhood. The simple text and familiar illustrations triggered a rush of memories. His mother's voice, soft and tired but never too exhausted to read one more story. The comfort of routine in a life that often lacked stability. He read slowly, letting Denise turn the pages, watching as her eyelids grew heavy with each repetition of good night. By the time he reached the final page, she was fast asleep, her small hand still clutching the corner of the book. Brian sat there for a moment, strangely reluctant to leave. There was something peaceful about watching Denise sleep, about being in this room that had briefly become a sanctuary for a child who had known too much uncertainty. When he finally stepped into the hallway, he found Carol waiting, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and uneasiness. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Brian nodded, suddenly eager to escape the weight of her gratitude and his own confusing emotions. I should go. There are spare keys in the drawer by the door. Lock up when I leave. Will you be back tomorrow? Carol asked. The question hung in the air between them. Brian hadn't planned beyond this moment. Logic dictated that he should remove himself from this situation, maintain a safe distance from these strangers who had somehow breached his carefully constructed emotional walls. Yes, he heard himself say, I'll check in tomorrow. As he drove to his primary residence, a modernist mansion 3 times the size of the lakefront property, Brian tried to make sense of his actions. He had spent decades building a life, defined by order and control, yet in the span of 24 hours he had willingly introduced chaos. Why? The answer eluded him, but as he entered his empty home, pristine, silent, and coldly perfect, he felt the absence of something he couldn't quite name, something he had glimpsed briefly in a simple pasta dinner and a child's bedtime story. Brian Mitchell, master of financial strategy and risk assessment, had encountered a variable he had no formula to calculate, and for the first time in years, he was curious to see where it might lead. The next morning, Carol woke early, her body conditioned by years of pre-dawn alarms for cleaning jobs that started while most clients still slept. For a moment she was disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, the spacious bedroom, the expensive sheets, the silence unbroken by neighbor noises or street traffic. Then, reality settled back in. They were staying in a stranger's home, their future still precarious despite this temporary respite. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Denise, who had crawled in beside her sometime during the night. The morning light filtered through the elegant drapes, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor. Carol allowed herself a moment to appreciate the beauty of the space, a luxury she rarely had time for in their harried former life. In the kitchen, Carol rummaged through the sparse pantry, mentally calculating how to stretch their limited resources. She had exactly $73 to her name, barely enough for a few days of basic necessities. The thought of spending any of it on food when they had access to this kitchen seemed foolish, yet her pride rebelled against using Brian's provisions without permission. Pride, however, had to take a back seat to practicality. Carol found coffee beans and a grinder, managing to figure out the complicated brewing system after a few false starts. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, providing a small comfort as she considered her next moves. She needed to call her former clients directly, bypassing the agency that had cut her hours. Some might hire her independently, though it would mean working without the insurance the agency provided. She also needed to contact her online course instructor, explain her situation, and see if there were any options for completing her certification despite her financial setback. Most urgently, she needed to find affordable housing, a nearly impossible task in a city where rent prices had skyrocketed beyond the reach of service workers. Even the shabbiest one-bedroom apartments required first and last month's rent plus a security deposit, far more than Carol could hope to save in the foreseeable future. The sound of small feet padding into the kitchen interrupted her worried thoughts. Denise appeared, hair tousled from sleep, eyes still half closed. "Good morning, sunshine," Carol said, pushing aside her concerns to smile at her daughter. "How did you sleep?" "Good," Denise yawned, climbing onto one of the high kitchen stools. "Is this still the castle today?" Carol's heart squeezed. "Yes, Mika, for today." "And the man, is he coming back?" "He said he would check in. His name is Mr. Mitchell." Denise nodded solemnly. "I like him. He reads stories good." Carol thought about the awkward way Brian had perched on the edge of the bed last night, as if afraid to disturb the carefully arranged pillows. There had been something touching about his discomfort, about the careful way he had held the tattered book and followed Denise's direction about which voices to use for different characters. "I need to make some calls," Carol told Denise as she set a bowl of cereal in front of her. "Grown-up business. Can you be my good girl and watch cartoons for a little while?" Denise nodded eagerly, the prospect of unrestricted television access temporarily overshadowing any concerns about their situation. Once Denise was settled in front of the enormous television, Carol retreated to the kitchen with her phone. The first few calls went as expected, sympathetic responses from former clients, but no immediate work opportunities. The fourth call, however, yielded a glimmer of hope. "I've been meaning to have a deep clean done," Mrs. Lawrenson said. "The agency always sends different people, and none of them are as thorough as you were. Could you come tomorrow? I'll pay cash." Carol quickly agreed, relief washing over her. One day's work wouldn't solve their problems, but it was a start. Her call to the online course administrator was less encouraging. Without payment, she couldn't access the remaining modules or take the certification exam. There was a hardship. Scholarship, but the application process would take weeks, and there was no guarantee she would qualify. By the time Brian's car pulled into the driveway that evening, Carol had mapped out a tentative plan. Take every independent cleaning job she could get, save every penny, and look for a room to rent rather than an apartment. It wasn't ideal. She hated the thought of Denise growing up in a single room, but it was better than a shelter, or imposing on Brian's unexpected generosity for too long. Brian entered the house carrying 2 large paper bags, the logo of an upscale grocery store emblazoned on the sides. He looked different today, less formal in dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, though Carol suspected Even his casual clothes cost more than her entire wardrobe. "I thought you might need some provisions," he said, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "I wasn't sure what you like, so I got basics." Carol peered into the bags, her eyes widening at the contents. These weren't basics by her definition. There were organic fruits, artisanal bread, premium cuts of meat, imported cheese, the kind of groceries she had seen while cleaning wealthy clients' homes, but never purchased for herself. "This is too much," she protested softly. Brian shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "It's nothing, really." From the living room, Denise's excited voice called out, "Mr. Mitchell, come see. I found a show about dancing penguins." A smile flickered across Brian's face, subtle but genuine. "Penguins, huh? I'd better check this out." He moved toward the living room, leaving Carol to stare after him in confusion. This wasn't how rich people behaved in her experience. The wealthy clients whose homes she cleaned barely acknowledged her presence, let alone showed interest in her or her child. Yet here was Brian Mitchell, bringing groceries and responding to Denise's call, with the bemused indulgence of a family friend rather than a distant benefactor. When Carol joined them a few minutes later, she found Brian seated on the couch, beside Denise, both of them watching animated penguins perform elaborate dance routines. Denise was providing running commentary on the characters' motivations, while Brian nodded with apparent interest. "Mama, Mr. Mitchell says he's never seen this show before. Isn't that crazy? And he's never had pizza rolls either." Carol raised an eyebrow at Brian, who offered a somewhat sheepish smile. "I may have led a rather curated life," he admitted. The phrase struck Carol as both accurate and oddly sad. Looking around the beautiful house with its perfect furnishings and absence of personal touches, she sensed that Brian's existence, for all its material privilege, lacked the messy authenticity that made a house a home. "Well, we can fix that," Carol heard herself say. "Denise and I make excellent pizza rolls." Brian's expression, surprise followed by a cautious warmth, confirmed her suspicion. This man, who could buy anything he wanted, was somehow missing the simple pleasures that even Carol, with all her financial struggles, had managed to provide for Denise. "So I'd like that," he said quietly. In the kitchen, Carol involved both Denise and Brian in the preparation of their simple meal. Denise stood on a stool, carefully arranging toppings on the small rounds of dough, while Brian, at Carol's direction, awkwardly attempted to crimp the edges closed. "Not like that," Denise giggled, taking the misshapen roll from his hands. "You have to pinch it tight or all the good stuff leaks out." Brian watched the child's small fingers deftly seal the edges. "You're very good at this," he observed. "Mama taught me," Denise said proudly. "We make food together lots of times. It's funner than just eating it." "More fun," Carol corrected automatically, but she smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "Don't you cook with anyone?" Denise asked Brian, her head tilted in genuine curiosity. Brian hesitated, his hands pausing in their clumsy attempts at food preparation. "No," he said finally. "I don't really cook at all." "But what do you eat?" "I order food or go to restaurants." Denise's eyes widened. "Every day? Like in the movies?" "Something like that," Brian admitted. "But who do you eat with?" Denise persisted, her young mind unable to comprehend a life without shared meals. The question hung in the air, its innocent directness exposing the emptiness at the core of Brian's existence more effectively than any adult observation could have. "Usually just me," Brian answered after a moment. Carol watched as something flickered in his eyes, a brief acknowledgement of lack in a life otherwise defined by abundance. She felt a surprising pang of sympathy for this wealthy man, whose solitary existence suddenly seemed poorer than her own, struggling but love-filled life with Denise. "Well, today you're eating with us," she said, her voice gentler than she intended. "And you have to eat all your pizza rolls or no dessert. House rules." Brian's smile was tentative but genuine. "I'll do my best to comply." Later, after they had eaten, and Denise had convinced Brian to play 3 rounds of a board game she had discovered in a cabinet, Carol noticed the tension that had perpetually tightened his shoulders had eased slightly. When Denise asked for another bedtime story, he agreed without hesitation, following her to the bedroom with none of the previous night's awkwardness. Carol used the time to make more calls, securing another cleaning job for the following week. When she returned to check on them, she paused outside the bedroom door, listening to Brian's voice as he read not just one story, but three, his tone becoming more animated with each tale. She hadn't expected this, not the groceries, not the board games, and certainly not the growing ease between Brian and Denise. His kindness was becoming something more complicated than simple charity, and Carol wasn't sure what to make of it. As much as she wanted to believe in fairy tales where millionaires rescued struggling single mothers from financial ruin, Carol had lived enough of real life to know better. People like Brian Mitchell didn't invite people like her into their world without expecting something in return. The question was, what did he want? When Brian emerged from Denise's room, closing the door softly behind him, he found Carol waiting in the hallway, her expression guarded. "She's asleep," he said, keeping his voice low. "I think 3 stories was her limit." Carol nodded. "You're good with her." Brian looked surprised by the observation. "She makes it easy. She's a remarkable child." "Yes, she is." Carol hesitated, then gestured toward the living room. "Could we talk for a minute?" Brian followed her, sensing the shift in her demeanor. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the physical distance mirroring the gulf between their worlds. "I need to understand what's happening here," Carol said finally, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Why are you doing all this? The house, the groceries, the games with Denise? What do you want from us?" Brian flinched slightly at the directness of her question. "I don't want anything." "Everyone wants something," Carol countered. "In my experience, people don't just give without expecting something in return." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of Carol's hard-earned wariness. She had learned through painful experience to question generosity, especially from men who took an interest in her daughter. The world had taught her that kindness often came with conditions, some spoken, others implied. Brian met her gaze, his expression shifting from surprise to something more complicated. He was silent for so long that Carol began to regret her bluntness. "I don't know," he finally said, the honesty in his voice catching her off guard. "When I saw you and Denise that night, something happened. I can't explain it." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him seem suddenly more human than the polished businessman she'd first encountered. "I've spent my entire adult life building walls around myself, making sure I never needed anyone, never depended on emotional connections that could complicate things." He glanced toward Denise's bedroom door, his voice softening. "But your daughter laughs in this house. Before you came, I don't think these rooms had ever heard laughter." Carol studied him, searching for deception but finding only vulnerability, a sentiment so genuine it seemed to surprise Brian himself. "I'm not looking for anything from you, Carol," he continued. "Maybe I'm just tired of living in beautiful, empty spaces." The simple admission disarmed her. Carol recognized the loneliness in his words because she had felt it too. Even surrounded by Denise's love, she had experienced the isolation of carrying all responsibilities alone, of having no adult to share either burdens or joys. "I got a cleaning job tomorrow," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "And another next week. I'll start paying you rent as soon as I can save enough." Brian shook his head. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Carol insisted. "I need to contribute. I can't—" She took a deep breath. "I can't teach Denise that women should depend on men's charity." Brian considered this, then nodded. Slowly. "I understand, but let's call it something else. You're helping maintain the house, making it lived in." A slight smile touched his lips. "God knows I've never managed that part well." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was one Carol could accept with her dignity intact. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the tension between them easing into something less defensive. "I should go," Brian said finally, standing. "I have an early meeting tomorrow." At the door, he hesitated. "There's a children's museum not far from here. Denise might enjoy it this weekend." He spoke casually, but Carol sensed an unasked question beneath the words. "She would love that," Carol replied carefully. "She's never been to a museum." Brian's smile was brief but genuine. "Saturday, then, I could—" We could all go. Carol nodded, acknowledging the invitation for what it was, not charity, but connection. Saturday, as she watched his car disappear down the driveway, Carol felt a confusing mixture of hope and apprehension. She had spent years building her own walls, protecting herself and Denise from disappointment. Now, like Brian, she was allowing those walls to crumble slightly, making space for something unexpected. What that something might be, she wasn't yet ready to name. The next morning, Carol woke before sunrise to prepare for her cleaning job. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake Denise, who would stay with Mrs. Hernandez, their former neighbor who had agreed to babysit. As she waited for her Uber, another expense she couldn't really afford but needed for punctuality, Carol felt the strange dissonance of her situation. She was leaving a mansion to clean someone else's home for cash, then returning to this borrowed luxury that wasn't truly hers. The contradiction made her dizzy if she thought about it too long. Mrs. Lawrenson greeted her warmly, showing Carol around the already immaculate apartment with detailed instructions about special cleaning products for the marble countertops and which heirlooms required extra gentle handling. Carol listened attentively, mentally calculating how long each task would take and whether the agreed-upon payment was fair for the work involved. It was hard, physical labor, scrubbing, dusting, polishing, vacuuming, but Carol found a certain satisfaction in the transformation of spaces under her care. There was something gratifying about seeing immediate results from her efforts, unlike so many other aspects of her life, where progress was slow and uncertain. As she worked, Carol thought about Brian and his strange, sterile homes. They were beautiful but untouched, as if waiting for life to begin. Her own apartments had always been the opposite, small, sometimes shabby, but filled with evidence of living. Denise's artwork taped to refrigerators, mismatched furniture chosen for comfort rather than style, the scent of home-cooked meals lingering in the air. By the time she finished, Carol's back ached, and her hands were raw despite the gloves, but the cash Mrs. Lawrenson pressed into her palm made it worthwhile. One day's work wouldn't solve their problems, but it was a start, a small piece of independence reclaimed. When she returned to Brian's house, she found Denise and Mrs. Hernandez in the kitchen. To Carol's surprise, they were baking cookies, flour dusting the expensive countertops, and Denise's face smeared with chocolate. "Mama, we're making surprise cookies for Mr. Mitchell," Denise exclaimed, running to hug Carol without regard for the chocolate transfer to her mother's clothes. Mrs. Hernandez gave Carol an appraising look. "Your friend has a very nice house," she said in Spanish, her tone making the word friend carry significant implications. "It's not what you think," Carol replied in the same language. "He's just helping us temporarily." Mrs. Hernandez raised an eyebrow, but didn't press the issue. "The child is happy here," she observed, "and you look less worried. That's good." After Mrs. Hernandez left, Carol helped Denise finish the cookies, trying not to wince at the mess they were making in Brian's perfect kitchen. They had just finished cleaning up when his car pulled into the driveway. Denise ran to greet him at the door, proudly announcing their baking achievement before he could even set down his briefcase. "We made you chocolate chunk cookies, and I put extra chunks in because Mama says you probably don't eat enough cookies." Brian looked startled, both by the enthusiastic greeting and the revelation. He glanced at Carol, who felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I don't remember saying exactly that," she began, but Brian's unexpected laugh cut her off. "Your mother's right," he told Denise, kneeling to her level in a gesture that seemed increasingly natural. "I definitely don't eat enough cookies. Thank you for fixing that serious problem." Over dinner, a simple stir-fry Carol had prepared with some of the groceries Brian had brought, Denise chatted excitedly about the museum trip planned for Saturday. Brian listened with genuine interest, occasionally catching Carol's eye with a smile that seemed to acknowledge the strangeness, but also the unexpected warmth of their situation. Later, after Denise was asleep, Brian lingered in the living room, asking Carol about her day with an attentiveness she wasn't accustomed to from anyone but Denise. "It's just cleaning," she said with a shrug. "Nothing interesting." "It's work. That matters," Brian countered. "People trusting you in their homes with their possessions. That takes skill and character. Carol studied him, trying to determine if he was being condescending, but found only sincerity in his expression. Most people don't see it that way, she said finally, especially people who can afford to pay others to clean. Brian acknowledged this with a slight nod. I've probably been guilty of that myself, not seeing the people who make my life easier. He hesitated, then added, My mother cleaned houses. After my father left, it was one of the 3 jobs she worked to keep us fed. The admission surprised Carol. She had assumed Brian came from privilege, that his wealth was inherited rather than earned. The revelation of his humble beginnings shifted something in her perception of him. You don't talk like someone who grew up poor, she observed. A wry smile touched his lips. I spent a lot of time and effort making sure of that. The right schools, the right accent, the right clothes. I was determined to erase any trace of where I came from. And did it work? Are you happier now that... No one can tell. The question caught him off guard. Brian was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. I'm successful, he said finally. I achieved everything I set out to do. The happiness part, and I'm not sure I factored that into the equation. The honesty of his response created a momentary bridge between their vastly different worlds. Carol recognized in Brian something she had felt herself, the exhaustion of constantly striving, of measuring success by survival rather than joy. Maybe that's something to work on next, she suggested softly. Brian's gaze met hers, warm and surprisingly vulnerable. Maybe it is. Saturday dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for their museum outing. Denise was up at dawn, too excited to sleep. She raced through the house, gathering her small backpack and favorite sneakers, asking Carol every few minutes if it was time to leave yet. The museum doesn't open until 10, Mija, Carol reminded her for the 3rd time. Mr. Mitchell won't. He'll be here for another hour. But what if he forgets? Denise asked, her expression suddenly anxious. What if he doesn't come? The question revealed a fear Carol recognized all too well, the deep-seated worry that people who promised to be there wouldn't follow through. It was a fear born from experience, from a father who had walked away before Denise was born, and a life where stability had been elusive. He won't forget, Carol assured her, though a small part of her harbored the same concern. Despite Brian's consistency over the past few days, Carol's instinct was still to prepare Denise for disappointment rather than trust in promises. But at precisely 9:30, Brian's car appeared in the driveway. Denise squealed with delight, rushing to the door before he could even knock. "How you came," she exclaimed, as if his arrival was a minor miracle. Something flickered in Brian's eyes, a recognition perhaps of the weight carried by such a simple statement. "Of course I did," he said gently. "I promised, didn't I?" The Children's Museum was designed for exploration and hands-on learning. Denise moved from exhibit to exhibit with boundless enthusiasm, tugging Brian along by the hand as if she'd known him all her life. Carol followed, watching as her normally reserved daughter blossomed under the attention of this unexpectedly patient man. In the water play area, Denise convinced Brian to roll up his sleeves and help her build an elaborate system of dams and channels. His designer watch was carefully set aside, his expensive shirt getting splashed, despite his best efforts. Yet, instead of the annoyance Carol expected, Brian seemed almost transformed, laughing alongside Denise, his usual stern expression replaced by genuine enjoyment. "Mama, look, we made a river system," Denise called, proudly gesturing to their creation. "Brian says all the water in the world is connected, just like people." Carol raised an eyebrow at the use of his first name, a transition she hadn't noticed happening. Brian gave a slightly sheepish shrug. "She said Mr. Mitchell was too long for emergencies," he explained. "I couldn't argue with her logic." By lunchtime, they had explored only half the museum. They ate in the museum cafe, simple sandwiches and fruit cups that Denise declared the best picnic ever. Brian insisted on paying, brushing aside Carol's protests with a gentle firmness. "Consider it my admission fee for having more fun than I've had in years," he said quietly, while Denise was distracted by the dessert display. After lunch, their exploration continued with renewed energy. In the building zone, Denise and Brian constructed an impressively tall tower of blocks. their heads bent together in serious consultation about structural integrity and weight distribution. Watching them, Carol felt a complex emotion she couldn't quite name. There was joy in seeing Denise so happy, but also a creeping worry about the attachment forming between her daughter and Brian. They couldn't stay in his house forever. Eventually, they would need to return to their real life, one that wouldn't include mansion living or museum trips with a kind millionaire. The thought cast a shadow over Carol's enjoyment of the day. She had allowed herself and Denise to step into a fairy tale. But fairy tales inevitably ended and reality returned. How would Denise handle that transition when it came? As if sensing her thoughts, Brian approached while Denise was occupied with a magnetic building exhibit. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You seem worried." Carol hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm concerned about Denise getting too attached. To you, to the house, and to all of this. It's not our real life." Brian's expression grew thoughtful. "What if it could be? Not exactly this, but something more stable than what you had before." "What does that mean?" Carol asked, her guard rising slightly. "I've been thinking about your medical coding courses," Brian said. "What if you could finish them, get certified, find a job with benefits?" "I could help with that." Carol stiffened. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Brian insisted, his voice low but intense. "It's an investment in you and Denise, in the future you're trying to build." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Carol now recognized as a sign of emotional discomfort. "Look, I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. Helping you finish your certification would be nothing to me financially, but it could change everything for you both." Carol wanted to refuse immediately. Pride demanded it. But practicality and motherhood required her to at least consider his offer. With certification, she could earn 3 times her current wages. She could provide Denise with stability, maybe even save for her education. "I'd pay you back," she said finally, "every penny." "If that's what you need to accept the help, then yes, you can pay me back," Brian agreed. "But there's no rush, and no interest. Just get your certification, find a good job, and build the life you want." Before Carol could respond, Denise called them over to see her latest creation. The conversation was left unfinished, but the possibility Brian had offered lingered in Carol's mind throughout the remainder of their museum visit. That night, after Denise had fallen asleep, reliving the day's adventures, Carol sat alone in the kitchen weighing her options. Brian's offer was generous, life-changing even, but accepting would mean acknowledging that she couldn't do it alone, that despite all her efforts and determination, she needed help. It was a bitter pill for someone who had prided herself on independence. Yet, as she thought about Denise, her bright curiosity, her potential, her right to a stable home, Carol wondered if pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. A soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted her thoughts. Brian stood there, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "Thought you might still be up," he said, offering her one of the mugs. "Mind some company." Carol accepted the tea with a nod. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke. "Why do you care what happens to us?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her since that rainy night when he first stopped his car. Brian considered the question, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "When I saw you that night," he began slowly, "you reminded me of my mother. Not physically, but the way you were protecting Denise, determined to shield her from everything, even when you were clearly struggling yourself." He took a deep breath. "My mother was like that. She worked herself to exhaustion to give us a better life, to make sure we never felt the full weight of our poverty." His voice grew softer, more reflective. "She died before I made any real money, before I could give her the comfortable life she deserved. I always thought I'd have time to repay her, to show her that her sacrifices meant something." He looked up, meeting Carol's gaze. "I can't do that now, but when I saw you and Denise, it felt like a second chance somehow." The raw honesty of his words touched something in Carol. She understood grief, understood the lingering regrets that came with losing someone you loved. Brian's explanation made sense in a way his earlier vague responses hadn't. "I'll accept your help with the certification," she said finally. "But I need you to understand something." She leaned forward, her expression serious. Denise and I aren't substitutes for your mother. We're not a second chance or a do-over. We're just us, complicated, messy, real people with our own story. Brian nodded slowly. I know that. I don't expect you to be anything other than who you are. He hesitated, then added, the truth is, having you both here has made me realize how empty my life was before. How much I've missed by focusing only on success and wealth. Carol understood what he wasn't quite saying, that in trying to help them, he had inadvertently helped himself. There was a balance in that exchange that made his offer easier to accept. Okay then, she said, extending her hand across the table. Partners, I finish my certification, get a proper job, and pay you back. Brian took her hand, his grip warm and firm. Partners. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed that none of them had anticipated but all seemed to welcome. Carol took cleaning jobs during the day and worked on her medical coding courses in the evenings. Brian spent more time at the lakefront house, often arriving in time for dinner and staying to read Denise her bedtime stories. Weekends became family outings, the zoo, the botanical gardens, a puppet show at the local theater. Brian displayed an unexpected enthusiasm for these simple activities, as if discovering childhood pleasures he had missed in his own youth. Carol watched the growing bond between Brian and Denise with a mixture of joy and cautious concern. Her daughter bloomed under his attention, showing him her drawings with proud confidence, asking him endless questions that he patiently answered. For his part, Brian seemed to delight in Denise's company, his usual reserve melting away in the face of her uninhibited affection. The dynamics between Carol and Brian also shifted subtly. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. She learned about his rise from poverty to wealth, the sacrifices and compromises he had made along the way. He heard about her struggles as a single mother, her dreams for Denise's future, her determination to create a life that was about more than just survival. They developed a comfortable rhythm of shared responsibilities, Brian helping Denise with her reading, Carol cooking meals they all enjoyed, both adults tackling weekend chores that somehow became less tedious when done together. It felt suspiciously like family, though neither of them named it as such. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching Denise chase fireflies in the twilight, Brian turned to Carol with uncharacteristic hesitation. I've been thinking, he began, his voice careful. The lakefront property is too big for just me. I bought it as an investment, but I've never really lived in it. He paused, watching Denise's delighted expression as she caught a glowing insect in her cupped hands. It feels more like a home with you both here. Carol felt her pulse quicken, sensing where the conversation was heading, but not quite ready to acknowledge it. What are you saying, Brian? He took a deep breath. Stay, not as guests or temporary residents. Make this your home, yours and Denise's. I'll sign over ownership of half the property to you. Carol stared at him, speechless. That's... you can't just... It's too much, she stammered. It's not charity, Brian said quickly, anticipating her objection. It's recognition of what you've brought into my life, of what we've created here together. His eyes, usually so confident, held a vulnerability she rarely saw. I was existing before, Carol, just going through motions, making money, buying things, filling spaces with expensive furnishings that meant nothing. Now I'm living, because of you, because of Denise. The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither had openly discussed until now. Carol looked away, watching her daughter's silhouette against the darkening sky. Denise was happy here, happier than Carol had seen her in years. She was thriving in the local school, making friends, bringing home art projects that covered the high refrigerator door. And Carol herself had changed too. The constant anxiety that had been her companion for so long had eased. She was halfway through her certification, excelling in her courses. For the first time, she could see a future that held more than just struggle and sacrifice. It's a lot to process, she said finally. I need time to think. Brian nodded. Of course, there's no rush. I just wanted you to know this isn't temporary for me, not anymore. The depth of feeling in his voice made Carol's heart beat faster. There was more between them than either had admitted, a connection that had grown naturally from shared meals, quiet conversations, and the joint care of a child who had somehow brought them together. That night, after Denise was asleep, Carol stood in the bedroom that had become hers, looking at the few possessions they had brought from their former life. A chipped mug Denise had decorated for Mother's Day, Carol's mother's faded recipe book, a small photo album of their life before, modest, apartments, simple celebrations, moments of joy carved out of difficult circumstances. Compared to the luxury that surrounded them now, these items seemed almost shabby, yet they represented who they were, where they had come from. Could they integrate that history into this new life Brian was offering? And what about Brian himself? Carol had carefully avoided examining her feelings for him, focusing instead on practical matters: Denise's well-being, her own education, their financial security. But in quiet moments like this, she couldn't deny the warmth that filled her when he entered a room, the comfort she found in their late-night conversations, the sense of rightness she felt when the three of them were together. Was it possible to build a life here with him, to create a family from such unlikely beginnings? Carol didn't have answers yet, but as she traced her finger along the spine of her mother's recipe book, she felt a sense of possibility that had been absent from her life for too long. Whatever she decided, she would choose from a position of strength rather than desperation. Brian had given her that, at least, the freedom to decide rather than merely react to circumstances. The next morning, Carol woke to the sound of Denise's laughter drifting from the kitchen. She found Brian and her daughter making pancakes, or attempting to. Flour dusted the countertops, and several misshapen pancakes lay abandoned on a plate. "Mama!" Denise exclaimed. "We're making special Sunday breakfast. Brian doesn't know how to flip pancakes without making them go splat." Brian gave Carol a rueful smile. "Your daughter is merciless in her culinary criticism." Carol couldn't help laughing at the domesticity of the scene. The powerful investment banker covered in flour, taking pancake flipping instructions from a 7-year-old. It was so far removed from how she had first perceived him, yet somehow it felt entirely right. As they ate their imperfect breakfast, Denise chattering about her plans to teach Brian how to make proper grilled cheese sandwiches next, Carol felt a certainty settle within her. This unconventional arrangement, this unexpected connection, it wasn't just a temporary refuge from hardship. It had become something more valuable, a chance for all of them to heal, to grow, to become the family none of them had imagined, but all of them needed. Later that day, while Denise was absorbed in a drawing project, Carol found Brian in his home office. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said without preamble. Brian looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "And?" "I can't accept. Ownership of half your house, it's not equal, not fair to you." Disappointment flickered across his face, quickly masked. "I understand. You don't have to—" "Let me finish," Carol interrupted gently. "I can't accept that because it would always feel like your house that you gave us part of. But I think," she took a deep breath, "I think we could build something together. Something new that belongs to all of us." Brian's eyes widened slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "Sell this house, and your other one. Let's find a place that's ours from the beginning, something we choose together that reflects all of us." She held his gaze steadily. "I'll still pay my way, finish my certification, contribute financially. But it would be our home, not yours that you're sharing." The smile that spread across Brian's face was unlike any expression she had seen from him before. Pure, unguarded joy. "You want to stay to make this us permanent?" Carol nodded, her own smile matching his. "Yes, it's unexpected and unconventional and probably a little crazy, but it feels right. For Denise, for me." She paused, her voice softening. "For you." Brian stood, moving around the desk to stand before her. Slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose, he took her hands in his. "Carol Martinez, you and your daughter have completely upended my carefully ordered existence, and I couldn't be more grateful." Carol laughed, the sound lighter than she could remember it being in years. "Is that your way of saying yes to starting over in a new place?" "It's my way of saying yes to starting over, period. A new home, a new life. Together." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "You were right that first night, you know. You're not a charity case. You never were. You're the woman who taught me that all my success meant nothing without someone to share it with." Carol felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness or worry, but from a happiness so unexpected it almost hurt. "And you're the man who showed me that accepting help doesn't mean giving up independence. It means building something stronger together." As if drawn by their voices, Denise appeared in the doorway, her expression curious. "Are you guys having a serious talk?" she asked, her perceptiveness catching them both off guard. Carol and Brian exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Brian who answered, kneeling to Denise's level. "Yes, we are. Your mom and I were talking about finding a new house, one that would be for all of us. What do you think about that?" Denise's eyes widened. "All of us? Like, forever?" "That's the plan," Brian confirmed, his voice gentle. "If it's okay with you." Denise's face broke into a radiant smile. "Like a real family, with you and everything." The question hung in the air, its innocent directness cutting through any remaining pretense. Brian looked up at Carol, a question in his eyes that went beyond houses and living arrangements. Carol nodded, tears now flowing freely. "Yes, Mika, like a real family." Denise launched herself at both of them, her small arms trying to encompass the adults in one enthusiastic hug. "I knew it. I wished for it every night, and it came true." Brian's arm circled Carol's waist as they both embraced Denise, the three of them connected in a moment that bridged past and future. Carol thought about the rainy night when Brian had stopped his car, the twist of fate that had brought them together, the unlikely journey from strangers to family. Some might call it chance, others destiny. Carol simply called it the beginning of their story, one they would write together page by page, day by day. Not a fairy tale, but something better, a real-life love story built on understanding, respect, and the courage to open hearts long, guarded by walls of different making but similar purpose. As Denise chatted excitedly about what her room in the new house might look like, Carol met Brian's gaze over their daughter's head. The tenderness she saw there matched the warmth in her own heart, a promise not of perfect happiness, but of a shared future where both joys and challenges would be faced together. It wasn't the life Carol had imagined for herself and Denise. It was better, richer, more complicated, more real than any dream she had dared to harbor in the darkest days of their struggle. A life built not on fairy tale rescue, but on mutual respect, shared growth, and the kind of love that sees clearly and chooses anyway. In the end, it wasn't about a millionaire giving keys to his house. It was about three people, wounded in different ways by life's hardships, finding in each other the missing pieces that made them whole. A family created not by blood or circumstance, but by choice. And as Brian's fingers interlaced with hers, Carol knew they had all made the right one.